The evening lights of the city glimmered like spilled jewels across the wide boulevard as a sleek black limousine rolled silently toward its destination. At the far end of the street stood the Aurelius, a restaurant whose very name carried the weight of exclusivity. The glass facade shimmered under golden chandeliers that glowed like miniature suns suspended above the grand entrance. Marble pillars stood proud on either side, polished until their veins of white and silver reflected the warm glow of torch-like sconces. Inside, only the wealthy dared to dine, for the Aurelius was not merely a place to eat. It was an institution, a stage for the powerful to be seen, a carefully curated gallery where fortunes whispered over wine glasses and reputations were polished under the soft flicker of candlelight. The restaurant's history stretched back decades, and it was whispered that presidents, film stars, and captains of industry had all once occupied the velvet chairs that glowed beneath the crystal light. To the world, it was the very definition of prestige. But to one young boy standing outside the tall glass doors, it was simply the place where he intended to have dinner. Nathan Carter, a 14-year-old student with a slender build and a quiet strength in his eyes, stood at the entrance with his school bag slung casually over one shoulder. His uniform was neat but ordinary, the kind of attire that blended into classrooms, not into glittering dining halls. His sneakers bore scuffs at the edges, his hoodie was plain gray, and though he had the composure of someone wise beyond his years, he looked out of place against the parade of well-dressed patrons gliding past him in tailored suits and shimmering gowns. Some cast quick glances at him, their brows arching ever so slightly, while others dismissed him altogether as though his very presence was a brief mistake in the portrait of perfection that was the Aurelius. But Nathan did not shrink back. His calm gaze swept over the tall glass doors, and with a deep breath, he reached forward and pushed them open. A gust of cold air spilled into the warmth of the interior, drawing a momentary hush among the diners seated closest to the entrance. Heads turned with mild curiosity before resuming their conversations, yet not all were willing to look away. Some eyes lingered on him, their expressions carrying the unspoken question, "What is someone like him doing here?" Behind the reception desk stood Ashley Miller, a waitress known among the staff not only for her sharp cheekbones and perfectly styled blonde hair, but for the way she wielded her judgment like a silent dagger. Ashley had worked at the Aurelius for years, long enough to craft an invisible hierarchy in her mind. To her, every guest who stepped through those golden doors could be placed neatly into categories: the regular elite whose wealth dripped from their very posture, the one-time strivers desperate to taste luxury, the occasional celebrity whose presence made her straighten her posture and soften her smile, and finally, those who didn't belong at all. Ashley prided herself on spotting the last group instantly, and in her eyes, Nathan fit the description too perfectly. She watched him walk toward her desk, her lips curving into the faintest smirk, a smirk that said she had already decided who he was before he had uttered a single word. The polished marble floor echoed faintly beneath Nathan's sneakers as he approached, and the grand chandeliers above refracted light that caught in his dark, thoughtful eyes. He stopped at the desk, his expression calm, polite, and without hesitation. He spoke in a voice steady enough to surprise Ashley. "Hello. I'd like to make a reservation." His words were simple, but Ashley's reaction was not. A small laugh escaped her lips, the kind of laugh that was less about amusement and more about derision. She tilted her head slightly, her manicured fingers tapping against the desk, her tone carrying the lilt of mockery as she replied, "Kid, are you sure you've got enough money to eat here?" Her words were not whispered. They were sharp and loud enough for nearby guests to hear, and indeed a few turned their heads discreetly, curious glances flickering between the neatly dressed waitress and the boy who had dared to step into their sanctuary. Nathan did not falter. He did not blush or lower his eyes as so many others might have under such scrutiny. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "Yes, I'd like to dine here tonight." His voice carried no arrogance, only certainty, but to Ashley, it sounded like insolence. She arched an eyebrow, amused by his audacity. Without even pretending to check her reservation list, she leaned slightly forward and declared, "We only accept guests with reservations, and looking at you, I'm sure you don't have one." Her smile was brittle, the kind of smile sharpened by condescension. Yet Nathan remained unshaken. "Could you double-check, please?" he asked, his eyes calm, his tone polite. But beneath it all was a quiet authority that unsettled her. With an exaggerated sigh, Ashley turned to the computer, her fingers tapping the keys with deliberate slowness. She already knew she would not find his name. After a moment, she spun back toward him with theatrical regret. "Oh, sorry. No reservation under your name. Maybe you should try somewhere more suitable for you." Ashley expected him to leave then, to walk out embarrassed, into the cold night. But Nathan didn't move. Instead, he looked at her steadily and asked, "So if I want to make a reservation now, can I?" For the first time, Ashley felt her composure slip, just a fraction. This boy wasn't following the script she had written in her mind. Annoyance flickered in her chest, but she forced another smile. "Sorry, but we don't accept walk-in reservations, it's the policy." Nathan's gaze flickered briefly toward the dining hall, where several empty tables sat gleaming beneath the chandeliers. He turned back to her and asked simply, "What about those empty tables? Who reserved them?" Ashley's smile froze. He had cornered her with a question she hadn't expected, and for a fleeting second, she hesitated. But then, regaining her confidence, she turned sharply, picked up a menu, and gestured for him to follow. "This way," she said sweetly, though her tone dripped with disdain. She led him past the glowing center of the restaurant, past the tables where the wealthy laughed over glasses of aged wine, and straight to a dim corner near the kitchen doors. The lights were weaker here, the hum of dishwashers faintly audible, and the air carried the clatter of pots and pans instead of the soft strings of music that floated across the main hall. Ashley dropped the menu onto the table with a deliberate thud. "You'll feel more comfortable here," she said, her smile more of a sneer. Nathan glanced at the table, then at her, his face unreadable, and simply said, "Thank you." His calmness unsettled her more than anger would have. At another table, Henry Thompson, an older gentleman in a tailored navy suit, had watched the entire scene unfold. Henry was a long-time patron of the Aurelius, a man of dignity who had seen wealth and arrogance dance together for decades. He had no fondness for Ashley's behavior, which he had observed in subtler forms before, but tonight it had taken an uglier shape. His eyes lingered on Nathan, the boy sitting with quiet grace in a corner that had been chosen to humiliate him, and Henry's thoughts stirred uneasily. There was something in the boy's composure, something in the way he sat, without complaint, that spoke volumes. Henry sipped his wine but kept his gaze fixed on Nathan. "That child is no ordinary one," he thought silently. Meanwhile, Ashley returned with her order pad, still convinced she had won her little game. "So, have you decided on your order?" she asked, her voice laced with boredom. Nathan closed the menu gently, looked up and replied with calm clarity, "I'll have the filet de Rossini, thank you." Ashley's smile faltered. The filet de Rossini was one of the most expensive dishes on the menu, a delicacy priced at $350, reserved for the elite. She leaned closer, her voice carrying a hint of malice. "Do you know this dish costs $350? Nathan met her eyes, unwavering. "Yes, sounds delicious." For a moment, Ashley felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her. This boy in worn sneakers and a school uniform, was not playing the part she had assigned him. And deep in her chest, though she would never admit it, a flicker of unease began to grow. The hush that followed Nathan's calm declaration seemed to stretch longer than it should have, as though the clinking of glasses and quiet murmur of voices from the main hall had been dimmed by some unseen force. Ashley's smile, once steady in its condescension, wavered, but she quickly tightened it into place, determined not to allow this boy to unsettle her further. "Very well," she said, her pen scratching across the order pad in deliberate strokes, though her eyes betrayed her irritation. "And a drink?" she asked with a mocking lift of her brow, expecting him to stumble here to reveal himself as someone playing out of his league. But Nathan, unshaken, answered softly, "Just water, please." His choice was simple, almost modest. Yet the way, he said it carried a weight of confidence that no expensive bottle of wine could have surpassed. Ashley turned sharply, heels clicking against the polished floor as she marched toward the kitchen, her thoughts a swirl of frustration. She had encountered difficult customers before, but this boy was something different. He refused to be categorized, refused to fit into the box she had crafted for him, and it irritated her in ways she couldn't understand. She told herself that the moment the bill arrived, he would falter. He would look embarrassed, unable to pay, and she would be proven. Right, that vision comforted her, but a small voice in the back of her mind whispered doubts she couldn't silence. At the corner table, Nathan sat quietly, his posture upright, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room with a serenity that unnerved even those who stole glances at him. The wealthy diners who had first dismissed him now whispered among themselves, curious about the boy who seemed untouched by Ashley's disdain. Some smirked, amused at what they assumed would end in humiliation. Others, however, found themselves unexpectedly intrigued by the way he carried himself. He wasn't slouched or fidgeting like a child caught out of place. Instead, he looked as though he belonged there in his own right, as though the golden chandeliers and polished silverware were merely background details to his quiet presence. Henry Thompson, seated by the window, continued to watch him with growing fascination. There was an unmistakable grace in the boy, one that reminded Henry of men he had met in boardrooms, men who commanded respect without raising their voices. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine as his mind turned over the possibilities. Who is this child, he wondered. Minutes later, Ashley returned with the dish balanced carefully on a silver tray, the aroma of truffles and seared beef wafting gently into the air. She set the plate before Nathan with a little more force than necessary, hoping perhaps to remind him of her disdain. "Your filet de Rossini," she said sweetly, her tone dripping with false politeness. Nathan looked at the dish, then at her, his expression calm as ever. "Thank you," he replied softly. He picked up his utensils, his movements composed, as though he had been trained in the etiquette of fine dining. To Ashley's dismay, there was no awkward fumbling, no hesitation, no hint of someone unfamiliar with the customs of a luxury restaurant. He cut into the beef delicately, lifted a bite, and tasted it with a composure that made her chest tighten. He didn't boast, didn't show off. He simply ate quietly, as though the corner table, the dim light, and the whispers around him were all irrelevant. That was when the first crack appeared in Ashley's confidence. She had placed him here expecting humiliation, but instead he sat like a prince in disguise, undisturbed and untouchable. The murmurs in the restaurant grew as more guests noticed him. A young couple whispered to each other, curious about how the boy could afford such a meal. A middle-aged man leaned toward his companion and muttered, "Perhaps his parents are arriving later." The speculation grew, but Nathan remained a calm center amid the storm. Ashley, however, could no longer contain her unease. She returned more often than necessary, hovering near his table, hoping to catch some sign of weakness. "Everything all right?" she asked at one point, her voice edged with forced politeness. Nathan looked up, his dark eyes calm and steady. "It's wonderful, thank you," he said simply, his words carrying no sarcasm, no defensiveness, only quiet truth. The sincerity disarmed her, and for the first time, she found herself without a cutting remark to deliver. In the main hall, Henry Thompson set his glass down, his decision made. Rising from his seat with the grace of a man used to commanding boardrooms, he walked slowly toward the corner table. The conversations around him dimmed as diners noticed his movement, for Henry was a man of influence whose presence commanded respect in these walls. He stopped by Nathan's table, offering a kind smile. "Mind if I join you for a moment, young man?" Nathan looked up, his calm expression softening slightly into a polite nod. "Of course," he said. Henry pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down, his eyes studying the boy with quiet curiosity. "I couldn't help but notice the way you handled yourself just now," Henry began, his voice deep but gentle. Not many your age could sit here, in this place under these circumstances, with such composure. Nathan paused, setting his fork down neatly. He met Henry's gaze unflinching. I believe respect is not about where you sit, he said softly, but how you carry yourself. Henry felt a smile tug at the corners of his mouth. It was an answer he hadn't expected, but one that resonated deeply. Across the room, Ashley watched the exchange with growing unease. She recognized Henry, of course, everyone did. He was one of the Aurelius's most respected patrons, a man who commanded quiet influence. Seeing him sit with Nathan, seeing him nod thoughtfully at the boy's words, made Ashley's stomach twist. She tried to remind herself that it didn't matter. Sooner or later, the boy would face the bill and everything would unravel. But as she turned to glance back at Nathan, she felt the first tremor of doubt. For reasons she couldn't explain, she had the sudden, uncomfortable sense that this boy was not who she had thought him to be. The evening stretched on, and Nathan continued his meal in peace, speaking occasionally with Henry, whose curiosity only deepened with each calm, thoughtful reply. Around them the whispers grew, and the atmosphere shifted subtly. What had begun as mockery in some corners of the restaurant was slowly being replaced with intrigue, even respect. The diners could sense it, though they couldn't yet articulate why. This boy, out of place as he seemed, carried an air of belonging that no one could deny. And then, just as the dessert menus were being placed on nearby tables, the doors of the Aurelius opened once more. The maitre d', usually composed, straightened suddenly, his face lighting up with a nervous smile. A tall man in an impeccably tailored suit strode in, his presence commanding immediate attention. The conversations hushed, the whispers stilled, and all eyes turned toward him. The man's gaze swept the restaurant with quiet authority, and when his eyes fell on the corner table where Nathan sat, they softened. He walked with measured steps toward the boy, and a ripple of realization began to spread among the diners. For those who recognized him, there was no doubt. This was Richard Carter, the enigmatic and powerful owner of the Aurelius itself. Ashley, frozen in place, felt the blood drain from her face. Her thoughts collided chaotically, denial and fear, tangling together as she watched Richard approach the table she had chosen to humiliate the boy. With every step he took, her certainty crumbled further. Because in that instant she realized the truth she had never even considered. Nathan wasn't an intruder in this world of luxury. He was the heir to it. He wasn't out of place at all. He was the very center of it, and she had just insulted the son of the man who owned everything her career depended on. The moment Richard Carter entered the restaurant, the air shifted with a weight that no one could ignore. His reputation preceded him. Those who frequented the Aurelius knew him not just as its owner, but as a man of immense influence whose empire stretched far beyond the velvet-draped walls of fine dining. His tall figure moved with quiet power, every detail of his presence radiating authority, from the perfectly cut suit that hugged his broad shoulders to the subtle confidence in his stride. Patrons who had once whispered mockingly about the schoolboy in the corner now fell into silence, their eyes darting between the boy and the man walking toward him. It was as if the room collectively held its breath, anticipating something monumental, though none of them could quite define what that was. Nathan looked up from his seat as his father approached, his calm demeanor shifting into the faintest smile. Subtle, yet warm with recognition. Richard's eyes, often sharp in business dealings, softened as they landed on his son. In that fleeting exchange of glances, father and son communicated what words did not need to express. An unbreakable bond of respect and understanding. Richard placed a firm hand on Nathan's shoulder before lowering himself into the chair beside him, his gaze sweeping the table and then the room with the ease of a king acknowledging his court. The silence that hung over the diners was pierced only by the faint clink of silverware and the low murmur of the kitchen in the distance. Ashley, standing stiffly a few feet away, felt her heart hammer against her chest. Her palms grew clammy, and for the first time in her years at the Aurelius, she wished she could vanish into thin air. The boy she had mocked, the boy she had deliberately seated in the shadowed corner as punishment for daring to step into her domain, was not just a customer. He was Nathan Carter, the son of the man whose very name commanded fear and respect among the elite. She felt her breath catch as Richard's gaze briefly brushed past her, not stopping but acknowledging, and that brief moment alone made her stomach twist with dread. Richard turned his attention to Nathan, his voice calm and steady, but carrying enough resonance that those nearby could hear. "I trust everything has been satisfactory, Nathan?" he asked, his tone one of both formality and genuine care. Nathan nodded, placing his utensils down neatly. "Yes, Father. The food is excellent. Though..." He paused, glancing toward Ashley with eyes that betrayed neither anger nor forgiveness, only a piercing clarity that made her shift uncomfortably where she stood. "The service has been rather unusual." The understatement was deliberate, his words gentle but edged with meaning. Richard followed his son's gaze, his sharp eyes settling on Ashley fully now for the first time. She felt pinned under that stare, as though every layer of arrogance she had worn had been stripped away in an instant. For a moment, no one moved. Then Richard leaned back, folding his hands neatly on the table, his expression calm but carrying a weight that silenced the room further. "Unusual service, you say?" he repeated softly, his tone deceptively even. Ashley swallowed hard, her throat dry, and forced herself to step forward, her professional smile quivering under the pressure. "So, sir," she began, her voice shaky despite her desperate attempt at composure. There must have been a misunderstanding. I didn't realize." Her words faltered as Richard raised one hand slightly, not in anger, but in quiet command, for her to stop. The diners, watching intently, felt a tension ripple through the hall. What they witnessed was more than just a confrontation between employer and employee. It was the unveiling of truth, the dismantling of hidden arrogance laid bare in front of an audience accustomed to masks of civility. Richard's eyes remained on Ashley, his voice calm but carrying a force that cut through her excuses. "You didn't realize what? That my son was worthy of respect? That every guest who steps through these doors deserves dignity, regardless of the shoes on their feet or the cut of their clothes?" His words, though quiet, struck harder than any shout could have. A few guests shifted in their seats, uncomfortable yet captivated, recognizing the lesson embedded in his rebuke. Nathan sat silently, his eyes watching not with glee or triumph, but with thoughtfulness. He had not sought to humiliate Ashley, nor did he revel in her discomfort. But he understood, as his father did, that lessons sometimes had to be delivered in moments such as these, when pride was at its most fragile and truth carried its sharpest edge. Ashley's lips trembled as she tried to summon a response, but the weight of Richard's gaze pinned her into silence. She finally lowered her head, her carefully curated poise shattered, and whispered, I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air, thin and brittle, and though it reached Nathan's ears, he knew it was not for him but for the man seated beside him. Richard, however, did not let it rest there. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping lower, meant for Ashley, but audible enough to those nearest to catch every word. "A restaurant like this is not built on chandeliers and fine wine. It is built on respect. For our patrons, for our staff, for the dignity of every person who walks through those doors. If you forget that, then you forget the very foundation of why we exist." His words carried not only authority but a moral clarity that pierced deeper than Ashley could bear. She nodded quickly, her head still lowered, her mind spinning with the crushing realization of how her actions had betrayed both her role and her employer. Around them, whispers began again, but this time they were different. They were not mocking or curious. They were reflective, filled with admiration for Richard's words and for Nathan's quiet grace. The diners who had once smirked now found themselves chastened, reminded of their own silent judgments and how easily they could fall into the same trap Ashley had stumbled into. Henry Thompson, watching from his nearby seat, felt a swell of respect rise in his chest. He lifted his glass toward Nathan in a small, unseen gesture of acknowledgement, silently commending the boy for the way he had carried himself with dignity long before his father arrived. Nathan, still composed, turned to his father. "Thank you for coming," he said softly. Richard gave him a faint smile, one that spoke of pride deeper than words could capture. "You handled yourself well, Nathan," he replied. "Better than many adults might have in your place." The boy's calm eyes glinted with a quiet humility, and he nodded gently, understanding that his father's presence had not been to rescue him, but to affirm what he had already proven, that dignity is not given by others but carried within oneself. Ashley retreated quietly, her steps unsteady as the atmosphere of the restaurant shifted once more. What had begun as a spectacle of arrogance had transformed into a lesson witnessed by all. A reminder that true worth is not measured by wealth or appearance, but by the integrity one holds even when tested. The Aurelius in that moment was no longer just a palace of luxury. It was a stage where humility had humbled arrogance and a boy had reminded a room full of the powerful what power truly meant. The silence that lingered in the restaurant after Richard's words seemed to settle into the velvet chairs and crystal glasses themselves, as though the very walls had absorbed the lesson he had spoken. Ashley retreated slowly, her polished shoes tapping against the marble floor with none of their former confidence, her head lowered as she disappeared toward the service station. The diners, still hushed, exchanged glances heavy with reflection. Conversations that moments ago had been full of laughter and indulgence now resumed only in muted tones, tempered by the uncomfortable awareness of what they had witnessed. Many of them knew deep inside that they too had judged the boy when he walked in, measuring him against invisible standards crafted by their own privilege. The shame of that realization clung to them like a faint shadow. Nathan, however, sat serenely, neither gloating over the shift in atmosphere, nor seeking validation in the glances that now looked upon him with respect. His dignity remained steady, untouched by the storm that had passed through the restaurant. Richard leaned back in his chair, his gaze resting on his son with the mixture of pride and curiosity that fathers rarely show in public, but which Nathan recognized instantly. "You remained calm," Richard said quietly, his voice low enough for only those closest to hear. "You endured humiliation without anger, and you met arrogance with composure. That, Nathan, is the mark of someone who understands that respect begins within." Nathan lowered his eyes briefly, his voice soft yet steady. "I didn't need to prove anything to her, father." She revealed herself with her own words. Richard allowed the faintest smile to crease his lips, nodding at the wisdom of his son's observation. Henry Thompson, still nearby, watched them with an admiration he rarely felt even in the company of powerful men. He raised his glass again, in a subtle gesture of respect toward Richard, but more importantly toward Nathan. Richard noticed the gesture and inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, but it was Nathan who gave Henry a small nod of appreciation, his eyes conveying a gratitude that needed no words. Henry felt a warmth stir in his chest. In a world dominated by wealth and status, it was rare to see such maturity in someone so young, and it was even rarer to see that maturity displayed in the face of prejudice. The maitre d', nervous and flustered from the scene, approached cautiously, his voice hushed as he leaned toward Richard. "Would you like us to move you and your son to a more central table, sir?" The question was tentative, meant as an attempt to restore balance and perhaps erase the embarrassment of having the owner's son seated in the dim back corner. Richard's response, however, was firm. "No, we will stay right here," he said, his tone carrying the weight of finality. His eyes swept the room as though challenging anyone to suggest otherwise. The message was clear. This corner, once chosen as a place of humiliation, would not diminish them. By remaining, Richard transformed it into a seat of dignity, a reminder that honor does not come from chandeliers or candlelight, but from the spirit carried to the table. Ashley, watching from afar, felt her stomach twist as the realization sank deeper with every second. Her arrogance had blinded her to the truth standing before her, and now her actions had been laid bare not just before her employer, but before the entire clientele. Every whispered glance she caught carried judgment, not for Nathan, but for her. She thought back on the countless times she had silently categorized guests, dismissing those who didn't look the part, convincing herself that her cruelty was professionalism. But tonight her illusion had been shattered, and she could no longer deny what she had become, a gatekeeper of prejudice in a place meant to celebrate excellence. Meanwhile, Richard shifted his attention back to Nathan, speaking softly as he reached for his glass of water. "You know, son, this world will test you often. It will try to measure you by your shoes, your clothes, the weight of your wallet, or the circles you move in. But if you remember today, if you remember how you sat here with dignity when others mocked you, then no one will ever truly be able to take your worth from you." Nathan listened intently, nodding slowly, absorbing every word not just as a lesson for tonight but as a compass for his life ahead. As dessert was offered, Nathan surprised his father by politely declining. "I think I've had enough," he said quietly. It wasn't that he didn't want it. It was that he had already tasted what he had truly come for, the test of his composure and the truth of his resilience. Richard studied him for a moment, longer, his eyes gleaming with pride that he did not speak aloud, for he knew his son understood without needing to hear it. The bill, when it arrived, was placed delicately on the table by a trembling young server who had watched everything unfold, with wide eyes. Ashley had deliberately avoided the task, but the staff whispered among themselves about how quickly the restaurant's hierarchy had been turned on its head. Richard lifted the folder and scanned it, though he hardly needed to. He placed a black card on the tray, his movements deliberate, and then looked toward Nathan. "Would you like to sign this time?" he asked gently, a small tradition he had begun to instill in his son whenever the opportunity arose. Nathan nodded, taking the pen with calm confidence and signing his name neatly, his young hand steady despite the weight of the eyes watching him. When the receipt was returned, Richard tipped generously, not out of show, but because generosity was his principle, his way of showing that dignity and respect did not vanish even in the face of arrogance. But the generosity was not meant for Ashley. Instead, he handed the young server who had brought the bill an additional note of gratitude, ensuring the lesson of the evening was one that rewarded humility rather than pride. The boy's eyes widened in disbelief, gratitude flooding his face, and Richard nodded subtly at him, a reminder that kindness travels farther than arrogance ever could. As Richard and Nathan rose to leave, the restaurant remained unusually silent. Diners shifted in their seats, some standing briefly in a gesture of respect as the father and son walked past. Nathan's steps were unhurried, his head held high, not in pride, but in quiet dignity. He did not glance at Ashley as they passed, her though he could feel her gaze burning with regret. Instead, he walked straight through the golden glow of the chandeliers, past the velvet chairs, past the marble pillars, until the cold air of the evening met his face once more. Richard walked beside him, their steps matching in rhythm, a picture of strength and unity. Behind them, the Aurelius remained filled with whispers, but they were no longer whispers of mockery. They were whispers of reflection, of admiration, of humility. For those who had witnessed the night, the story of the boy in worn sneakers who revealed the true meaning of dignity would not be forgotten. And for Ashley, whose arrogance had been exposed under the unforgiving light of truth, the lesson would echo in her mind far longer than the glitter of chandeliers could blind her. The cool night air wrapped around Nathan and his father as they stepped out of the Aurelius, the city's neon lights painting streaks of gold and silver across the black of the limousine waiting at the curb. The street outside was busy with life, cars passing, laughter spilling from nearby cafes, the distant rhythm of music. But in the quiet bubble between father and son, there was only reflection. Richard paused for a moment before opening the car door, looking down at Nathan, with a gaze that mingled pride, concern, and the silent weight of expectation. "You understand now, don't you?" he asked softly, his voice not demanding but searching, as though this night was meant not just to test Nathan, but to reveal something to him. Nathan nodded slowly, his eyes steady as he replied, "Yes, Father. I understand that respect isn't something people hand to you because of money or names. It's something you carry yourself even when others refuse to see it." Richard's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "Exactly. And you carried it tonight better than many men twice your age." The car pulled away from the curb, gliding smoothly into the rhythm of the city. But Nathan's thoughts lingered in the restaurant. He thought of Ashley's sneer, the whispers of the wealthy diners, the way the room had shifted when his father arrived. Yet none of it had shaken him. He realized now that the real test had not been whether he could afford the food or whether others approved of him. The real test had been whether he could hold on to his dignity when stripped of approval altogether. He leaned back against the seat, the city lights flashing past the tinted windows, and let that truth settle into his heart. Meanwhile, inside the Aurelius, the atmosphere did not return to its usual easy glamour. The diners remained restless, their conversations carrying an undertone of reflection. Some felt shame for their silence when they had witnessed the injustice. Others were struck by the clarity of Richard's words that exposed how easily even the wealthy could be blinded by appearances. Ashley, however, sat alone in the staff lounge, her uniform immaculate, but her spirit fractured. She replayed every detail of the evening in her mind from the moment Nathan walked through the door to the instant she realized who he truly was. The arrogance she had once worn like armor now felt like chains dragging her down. She realized that she had not just insulted a boy, she had betrayed the values of the very place she worked for. Her eyes burned with tears she had no intention of showing, but deep within her she knew she would never again look at a guest the same way. For perhaps the first time in years, humility found a place in her heart. Word of the incident spread quickly among the city's elite. Those who had been present at the Aurelius that night carried the story beyond its walls, retelling it in their offices, their dinner parties, their boardrooms. Each time it was told, the details shifted slightly, but the heart of it remained the same. A boy in school uniform entered a restaurant of the wealthy, was mocked by a staff member, and revealed in silence and composure that dignity cannot be bought or measured by appearance. By the time the tale circled back to Richard's ears through acquaintances, it had become something of a parable whispered among the city's socialites. Richard listened quietly each time, never correcting, never boasting, allowing the story to take on a life of its own. For him, the truth was simpler. It was not about reputation, but about preparing his son for a world that would never stop testing him. Days later, Nathan returned to school. Among his classmates, he was still just the quiet, intelligent boy in worn sneakers who carried himself with unusual calm. They did not know what had transpired at the Aurelius, and Nathan did not feel the need to tell them. Yet those who knew him best began to sense a subtle change. His gaze seemed clearer, his voice steadier, his presence more commanding in ways he did not force but simply embodied. Teachers noticed the quiet confidence with which he answered questions, the grace with which he handled disagreements. His friends noticed that even when teased, Nathan never rose to anger but carried himself with the same serenity he had held in the corner of that restaurant. He was no longer just a boy learning lessons. He was becoming a young man embodying them. Richard, too, noticed the change. At home, he watched his son with quiet pride, understanding that the night at the Aurelius had planted a seed that would grow for years to come. "You will inherit many things from me," Richard said one evening as they sat together in his study, the shelves lined with books, and the air thick with the smell of leather and oak. "You will inherit wealth, influence, and the weight of responsibility. But none of those will matter if you do not first inherit dignity. Tonight showed me that you already have." Nathan listened, his young face calm, his eyes glowing with quiet determination. "I don't want to be respected just because of your name," he said. "I want to be respected because of how I live." Richard leaned back, closing his eyes, briefly as if to hide the emotion threatening to rise. "Then, my son, you will build something greater than even I have." As months turned into years, the story of the boy in the restaurant lingered like an echo in the city. People remembered it not just as a tale of humiliation turned on its head, but as a reminder of the deeper truths they often forgot. That wealth could buy chandeliers but not respect, that fine clothes could command glances but not dignity, that the truest strength often resided in those who spoke the least. Nathan carried the memory not as a wound, but as a foundation, a compass guiding him whenever the world tried to reduce him to appearances. Ashley remained at the Aurelius, but she was never the same. Each time a guest entered who seemed out of place, her instinct to judge was checked by the memory of the boy's calm eyes and her employer's quiet rebuke. She served each guest with genuine politeness, learning slowly, painfully, that true hospitality was not about recognizing wealth but about recognizing humanity. In her quiet moments, she often wondered whether Nathan ever thought of her again. Perhaps he had forgotten her entirely, but she would never forget him. For in the boy she had once dismissed, she had encountered the mirror of her own arrogance, and through that the beginning of her transformation. And so, the tale closed not with the glitter of chandeliers or the weight of silver platters, but with a lesson etched in the hearts of all who had witnessed it. That dignity does not bow to wealth, that respect is not a gift given by others, but a light carried within, and that even in the smallest of frames, even in the humblest of appearances, there can reside a strength that silences arrogance and reshapes hearts. Nathan Carter had walked into the Aurelius, a boy in school uniform, judged and mocked. He had walked out not just as the heir to an empire, but as proof that true nobility is not worn, it is lived.